Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. For right now, I will be bringing you Esio Trot. Esio Trot. I don't know why I said it like that. But this book is by Roald with the illustrations by Quentin Blake, like all of them so far. Pretty sure all of the illustrations for Roald are by Quentin Blake. But I can't say for sure, so I'm just going to say it every time. Plus, he deserves credit. Sorry, I'm just something that stuck to it. So let's get right into it with chapter 1. This is the author's note, starting on page 5. Some years ago, when my own children were small, we usually kept a tortoise or two in the garden. In those days, a pet tortoise was a common sight crawling about on the family lawn or the backyard. You could buy them quite cheaply in any pet shop, and they were probably the least troublesome of all childhood pets, and quite harmless. Tortoises used to be brought into England by the thousand, packed in crates, and they came mostly from North Africa. But now, many years ago, a law was passed that made it illegal to bring any tortoise into the country. This was not done to protect us. The little tortoise was not a danger to anybody. It was done purely out of kindness to the tortoise itself. You see, the traders who brought them in used to cram hundreds of them tightly into packing crates, without food or water, and in such horrible conditions that a great many of them always died on the sea journey over. So rather than allow this cruelty to go on, the government stopped the whole business. The things you are going to read about in this story all happened in the days when anyone could go out and buy a nice little tortoise from a pet shop. Esio Trot. The picture. Chapter 1, starting on page 9. Look at how, that's such a cute picture. Alright. We're going to do a light accent. Mr. Hop lived in a small flat high up in the tall concrete building. He lived alone. He had always been a lonely man, and now that he was retired from work, he was more lonely than ever. There were two loves in Mr. Hop's life. One was the flowers he grew on his balcony. They grew in pots and tubs and baskets, and in summer the little balcony became a riot of color. Mr. Hop's second love was a secret he kept entirely to himself. The balcony immediately below Mr. Hop's jutted out a good bit further from the building than his own, so Mr. Hop always had a fine view of what was going on down there. This balcony belonged to an attractive middle-aged lady called Miss Silver. Mrs. Silver was a widow who also lived alone, and although she didn't know it, it was she who was the object of Mr. Hop's secret love. He had loved her from his balcony for many years, but he was very shy. He was a very shy man, and he had never been able to bring himself to give her even the smallest hint of his love. Every morning, Mr. Hop and Mrs. Silver exchanged polite conversation, the one looking down from above, the other looking up, but that was as far as it ever went. The distance between the balconies might not have been more than a few yards, but to Mr. Hoppy, I don't know why I've been calling him Mr. Hop. It's Mr. Hoppy. But to Mr. Hoppy, it seemed like a million miles. He longed to invite Mrs. Silver up for a cup of tea and a biscuit, but every time he was about to form the words on his lips, his courage failed him. As I said, he was a very, very shy man. You can find him among the flowers. Okay, I just want to say that just sounds like a little kid crush, losing the courage. Oh, if only, he kept telling himself, if only he could do something tremendous, like saving her life or rescuing her from a gang of armed thugs. If only he could perform some great feat that would make him a hero in her eyes. If only. The trouble with Mrs. Silver was that she gave all of her love to somebody else, and that somebody else was a small tortoise called Elfie. Every day when Mr. Hoppy looked over his balcony and saw Mrs. Silver whispering endearments to Elfie and stroking his shell, he felt absurdly jealous. He wouldn't even have minded becoming a tortoise himself if it meant Mrs. Silver stroking his shell every morning and whispering endearments to him. The pictures. Gotta make sure I'm showing them. Elfie had been with Mrs. Silver for years, and he lived on her balcony summer and winter. Planks had been set around the sides of the balcony so Elfie could walk about without toppling over the edge, and in one corner there was a little house into which Elfie would crawl every night to keep him warm. When the colder weather came along in November, Mrs. Silver would fill Elfie's house with dry hay, and the tortoise would crawl in there and bury himself deep under the hay and go to sleep for months on end without food or water. This is called hibernating. In early spring, when Elfie felt the warmer weather through his shell, he would wake up and crawl very slowly out of his house onto the balcony, and Mrs. Silver would clap her hands with joy and cry out, "Welcome back, my darling one! Oh, how I've missed you!" It was times like these when Mr. Hoppy wished more than ever that he could change places with Elfie and become a tortoise. Now we come to a certain bright morning. Oh, here's the picture. There's going to be a lot of pictures in this book, holy cow. Now we come to a certain bright morning in May when something happened that changed and indeed electrified Mr. Hoppy's life. He was leaning over his balcony rail watching Mrs. Silver serving Elfie his breakfast. "Here's the heart of lettuce for you, my love," she was saying, "and here's celery, fresh tomato, and a piece of crispy celery." "Good morning, Mrs. Silver," Mr. Hoppy said. "Elfie's looking well this morning." "Isn't he gorgeous?" Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming at him. The picture. "Absolutely gorgeous," Mr. Hoppy said, not meaning it, and now, as he looked down at Mrs. Silver's smiling face, gazing up at his own, he thought for the thousandth time how pretty she was, and how sweet and gentle and full of kindness, and his heart ached with love. "I do wish he would grow a little faster," Miss Silver was saying. "Every spring when he wakes up from his winter sleep, I weigh him on the kitchen scales, and you know that in all the 11 years I've had him, he's not gained more than 3 ounces. That's almost nothing." "What does he weigh now?" Mr. Hoppy asked her. "Just 13 ounces, Mrs. Silver answered. "About as much as a grapefruit." "Yes, well, tortoises are very slow growers," Mr. Hoppy said solemnly, "but they can live for 100 years. "I know that," Mrs. Silver said, "but I do so wish he would grow just a little bigger. He's such a tiny wee fellow." "He seems just fine as he is," Mr. Hoppy said. "No, he's not fine," Mrs. Silver cried. Oh, here's the pictures. "Try to think how miserable it must make him feel to be so titchy. Everyone wants to grow up." "You really would love him to grow bigger, wouldn't you?" Mr. Hoppy said, and even as he said it in his mind suddenly went click, and an amazing idea came rushing into his head. "Of course I would," Mrs. Silver cried. "I'd give anything to make it happen. Why, I've seen pictures of giant tortoises that are so huge people can ride on their backs. If Elfie were to see those, he'd turn green with envy." Mr. Hoppy's mind was spinning like a flywheel. Here, surely was his big chance. Grab it, he told himself. Grab it quick. "Mr. Silver," he said, "I do actually happen to know how to make tortoises grow faster, if that's really what you do want." "You do?" she cried. "Of course, please tell me. Am I feeding him the wrong things?" "I worked in North Africa once," Mr. Hoppy said. "That's where all these tortoises in England come from, and a Bedouin tribesman told me the secret." "Tell me," cried Miss Silver. "I beg you to tell me, Mr. Hoppy. I'll be your slave for life." When he heard the words, "your slave for life," a little shiver of excitement swept through Mr. Hoppy. "Wait there," he said. "I'll have to go in and write something down for you." Here's the pictures. In a couple of minutes, Mr. Hoppy was back on the balcony with a sheet of paper in his hand. "I'm going to lower it to you on a bit of string," and he said, "or it might blow away. Here it comes." Mrs. Silver cut the paper and held it in front of her. This is what it read. Esio Trot, treg regum regum, emok no, Esio Trot. Warpu, fafpu, tuspu, grunspu, warpu, lispu, ergo, liskag, futsaplug, tapnotaf, Esio Trot, tapnotaf, tegno, tegno, elbog, doof. What does this mean, she asked. Is this another language? It's tortoise language, Mr. Hoppy said. Tortoises are very backward creatures, therefore they can only understand words that are written backwards. That's obvious enough, isn't it? I suppose so, Mrs. Silver said, bewildered. Esio Trot is a simple tortoise spelled backwards, Mr. Hoppy said. Look at it. So it is, Miss Silver said. The other words are spelled backwards too, Mr. Hoppy said. If you turn them around in human language, they simply say, tortoise, tortoise, get bigger, bigger. Come on, tortoise, grow up, puff up, shoot up. Spring up, blow up, swell up, gorge. Guzzle, stuff, go. Put on fat, tortoise, put on fat. Get on, gobble food. Mrs. Silver examined the magic words on the paper more closely. I guess you're right, she said. How clever. But there's an awful lot of poos in it. Are they something special? Here's him handing it to her. And there's the pictures that we're on. Poo is a very strong word in any language, Mr. Hoppy said, especially with tortoises. Now what you have to do, Miss Silver, is hold Elfie up to your face and whisper these words to him 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. Let me hear you practice them. Very slowly, stumbling a little over the strange words, Mrs. Silver read the whole message out loud in tortoise language. Not bad, Mr. Hoppy said, but try to get a little more expression into it. When you say it to Elfie, if you do it properly, I'll bet you anything he will like that. In a few months' time, he'll be twice as big as he is now. I'll try it, Mrs. Silver said. I'll try anything, of course I will, but I can't believe it'll work. You wait and see, Mr. Hoppy said, smiling at her. Back in his flat, Mr. Hoppy was simply quivering all over with excitement. Your slave for life, he kept repeating to himself. What bliss! But there was a lot of work to be done before that happened. The only furniture in Mr. Hoppy's small living room was a table and 2 chairs. These he moved into his bedroom, Then he went out and bought a thick sheet of canvas and spread it over the entire living room floor to protect his carpet. Next, he got out the telephone book and wrote down the addresses of every pet shop in the city. There were 14 of them altogether. There's him dancing about and getting things ready to write down the addresses. I feel like he's about to do something fishy. And I don't think there's any chapters in this, so we're just going to read straight through. It took him 2 days to visit each pet shop and choose his tortoises. He wanted a great many, at least 100, perhaps more, and he had to choose them very carefully. To you and me, there is not much difference between one tortoise and another. They differ only in the size and in the color of the shells. Elfie had a darker shell, so Mr. Hoppy chose only the darker-shelled tortoises for his great collection. Size, of course, was everything. Mr. Hoppy chose all sorts of different sizes, some weighing only slightly more than Elfie's 13 ounces, others a great deal more, but he didn't want any that weighed less. Feed them cabbage leaves, the pet shop owner told him. That's all they need, and a bowl of water. Feed them cabbages, the pet shop owner told him. That's all they need, and a bowl of water. Sorry, I didn't give him an. This is him at the pet shop. I didn't give the dude a name. I mean, a voice, but yeah. Oh, boy. Look at that. That's him with all the tortoises. Holy cow. When he had finished, Mr. Hoppy, in his enthusiasm, had bought no less than 140 tortoises, and he carried them home in baskets, 10 or 15 at a time. He had to make a lot of trips and was quite exhausted at the end of it, but it was worth it. Boy, was it worth it. And what an amazing sight his living room was when they were all in there together. The floor was swarming with tortoises of different sizes, and some walking slowly about and exploring, some munching cabbage leaves, others drinking water from a big, shallow dish. They made just the faintest rustling sound as they moved over the canvas sheet, but that was all. Mr. Hoppy had to pick his way carefully on his toes between his between this moving sea of brown shells whenever he walked across the room. But enough of that. We must get on with the job. Before he retired, Mr. Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus garage, and now he went back to his old place of work and asked his mates if he might use his old bench for an hour or two. What he had to do now was to make something that would reach down from his own balcony to Mrs. Silver's balcony and pick up a tortoise. That was not difficult for a mechanic like Mr. Hoppy. First he made 2 metal claws or fingers, and he attached to the end of he attached to the end of a long metal tube. He ran 2 stiff wires down the inside of the tube and connected them to the metal claws in such a way that when he pulled the wires, the claws closed, and when he pushed them, the claws opened. The wires were joined to a handle at the other end of the tube. It was all very simple. Mr. Hoppy was ready to begin. Here's him at his workshop. Mrs. Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Mr. Hoppy. So, on the first exciting afternoon, after he had made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to the work, Mr. Hoppy went out onto his balcony armed with his long metal pole. He called this his tortoise catcher. He leaned over the balcony railings and lowered the pole down onto Mrs. Silver's balcony.